The moment my father's hand connected with the loan sharks in that grimy warehouse, sealing my fate for $50,000, I had to bite the inside of my cheek to keep from smiling. The rusted metal walls echoed with the sound of cash being counted, each bill a testament to how little I was worth to the man who should have protected me. My wrists were already raw from the rope binding them, a theatrical touch my father had insisted on to make the transaction seem more legitimate, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the savage satisfaction burning in my chest. "Count it again," the loan shark commanded, his voice a low rumble that made my father's hands tremble as he fumbled with the bills. The man they called Chen, the collector, stood in shadow, but I could see enough. The expensive suit that seemed out of place in this decrepit building, the silver watch catching what little light filtered through the broken windows, and most importantly, the small scar above his left eyebrow that I'd been searching for. My father stuffed the money into his briefcase with the desperation of a drowning man grasping for air. "She's yours now. Do whatever you want with her. She's been nothing but a burden anyway." Those words should have destroyed me. In my first life, they had. In my first life, when this exact scene had played out 3 years ago, I'd sobbed and begged, not understanding why my father would sell his own daughter to settle his gambling debts. I'd screamed for my mother, not knowing she'd been dead for only 2 months, killed in what everyone called an accident, but what I now knew was murder. But this wasn't my first life. "Get out," Chen the collector said to my father, stepping forward into the dim light. My father didn't need to be told twice. He scrambled toward the door, briefcase clutched against his chest, not even sparing me a backward glance. The warehouse door slammed shut, leaving me alone with the man everyone in the underworld feared. Chen walked around me slowly, his footsteps deliberate on the concrete floor. I kept my head down, playing the part of the terrified girl, but my mind was racing through everything I knew would happen next. In my previous life, this man had seemed like a monster. He'd taken me to his estate, and I'd discovered the truth only when it was too late to matter, when I was already dying from the poison my stepmother had been feeding me for months, the same poison that had killed my mother. "Do you know who I am?" he asked, stopping directly in front of me. "You're Chen the collector," I whispered, injecting just enough fear into my voice. "Everyone knows who you are." He reached down and tilted my chin up with one finger, forcing me to meet his eyes. In the dim light, I could see them clearly now. The same unusual green-gold color as my mother's eyes, the eyes I'd inherited. His expression shifted almost imperceptibly. "No," he said quietly. "Do you know who I really am?" In my first life, I'd said no. This time, I let a single tear roll down my cheek and whispered, "Uncle Marcus?" The rope around my wrist was cut in one swift motion. My mother had been the golden child of the Chen family, born into a world of unimaginable wealth and power that she'd walked away from to marry my father, a charming professor who'd swept her off her feet with poetry and promises. What she hadn't known was that he'd targeted her specifically, seeing her as his ticket to easy money. When she'd refused to ask her family for funds, when she'd insisted they live on their modest means, his true nature had emerged. The Chen family had cut her off completely when she'd married him. It was their way. You were either fully in the family or you were dead to them. My mother had chosen love, or what she thought was love, and they'd honored her choice by erasing her from their world. But Marcus Chen, her younger brother, had never stopped watching from the shadows. I learned all of this in my first life, but only in fragments and only too late. I'd learned it from documents I'd found while dying, from conversations I'd overheard between my father and stepmother as they celebrated my impending death, from the investigator Marcus had hired who'd arrived just hours after I'd taken my last breath. The poison had been elegant in its cruelty, a slow-acting compound that mimicked a wasting disease, administered in small doses through my food. My stepmother, Dr. Helena Marsh, was a respected pharmacologist who'd married my father just 6 months after my mother's death. She'd brought with her a daughter, Jessica, who was everything I wasn't. Brilliant, beautiful, and cruel, in the way only someone raised to believe they deserved everything could be. The early years had been a masterclass in psychological torture. Every achievement I managed was dismissed or attributed to Jessica. When I'd won the school science fair in middle school, my project had mysteriously disappeared, and Jessica's identical one had taken first place at the regional competition. When I'd been accepted into the honors program, my acceptance letter had been burned, and I'd been told I'd been rejected. When my mother's grandmother, my great grandmother, had left me a small inheritance, the money had vanished into family expenses that somehow only benefited Jessica. But it was the systematic isolation that had been the most effective weapon. Friends were driven away by carefully orchestrated rumors. Teachers received anonymous tips about my supposed cheating, drug use, and violent tendencies. By high school, I was a pariah with grades that barely kept me from dropping out. Not because I wasn't smart, but because every assignment I submitted was somehow lost or accidentally destroyed. My father had been complicit in all of it. The man who'd once pretended to love my mother had revealed his true face the moment she was gone. He'd needed her alive just long enough to ensure his place in her will, to gain access to the life insurance policy, to establish himself as the grieving widower. Then Helena had entered the picture, and together they'd worked to erase every trace of my mother's existence from our home. The photos disappeared first. Then her clothes were donated to help with the grieving process. Her jewelry was sold for my college fund, a fund that would never materialize. Her books, her music, even her perfume. Everything that might remind me that I'd once been loved vanished piece by piece. I'd tried to fight back in small ways. I'd hidden a photo of her in my school locker, but Jessica had found it and posted copies all over school with cruel captions about my dead mommy issues. I'd saved money from lunches I skipped to buy a small bottle of her perfume, but Helena had found it and poured it down the drain while I watched, telling me I needed to move on from unhealthy attachments. The physical abuse had started when I turned 16. Nothing that would leave visible marks, of course. Helena was too smart for that. Instead, it was accidents. Being pushed downstairs when no one was watching, having my hand accidentally slammed in car doors, finding my food contaminated with things that would make me violently ill but couldn't be proven as deliberate. Jessica had participated with enthusiasm. She'd learned from her mother that I was less than human, a problem to be solved rather than a person to coexist with. She'd steal my assignments and submit them as her own, knowing that no teacher would believe I'd written them when my grades were so poor. She'd seduce any boy who showed interest in me, not because she wanted them, but because she wanted me to have nothing. She'd whisper poison in the ears of anyone who might have been kind to me, spinning tales of my supposed mental instability, my violent tendencies, my pathological lying. The college situation had been the breaking point in my first life. I'd worked myself to exhaustion to get my grades up senior year, had applied to schools far away where I could start over. When the acceptance letter from State University had arrived, along with a partial scholarship I'd earned through an essay contest Helena didn't know about, I'd felt hope for the first time in years. That hope had lasted exactly 3 days. Helena had called the university, posing as a concerned medical professional, and reported that I'd been undergoing treatment for severe psychological disorders. She'd provided forged medical documents suggesting I was a danger to myself and others. The acceptance had been revoked. The scholarship had been withdrawn. And when I'd confronted them, my father had simply shrugged and said it was for my own good. I clearly wasn't mentally stable enough for college. That's when they'd started the poison. It had been perfect, really. A slow decline that everyone could attribute to depression over the college situation. Weight loss, fatigue, occasional confusion, all symptoms that could be explained away. Helena would express concern to neighbors and family friends, playing the devoted stepmother trying to help her troubled stepdaughter. Jessica would tearfully tell her friends how worried she was about her sister's deteriorating mental health. By the time I'd realized what was happening, I was too weak to fight. The poison had a cumulative effect, each dose building on the last, creating damage that couldn't be reversed. I'd tried to get help, but who would believe the ravings of a girl everyone knew was mentally unstable? Even the hospital had sent me home with pamphlets about eating disorders and depression. Helena by my side, promising she'd get me the help I needed. I died alone in my room, listening to Helena and my father discussing how long they'd have to wait after my death to sell the house. Jessica had been trying on my mother's wedding dress, the one thing they'd kept, hidden away for Jessica to wear at her own wedding someday. But then I'd woken up, not in death's embrace, but in my own bed, 3 years in the past. On the morning of my 18th birthday, the day everything had started to escalate toward that final, terrible end. I'd woken up with all my memories intact, all the knowledge of what would come, and most importantly, with information I'd only learned in those last dying days. My mother hadn't just come from money. The Chen family was one of the most powerful underground organizations in the country, controlling everything from legitimate businesses to less savory enterprises. They operated in shadows, their true influence hidden behind shell companies and false identities. My mother had been the heir apparent before she'd walked away, and her death hadn't been the accident everyone believed. Helena had been hired to kill her. My father had arranged it all, thinking that with my mother gone and me under his control, he'd eventually be able to access the Chen fortune. What he hadn't known was that the Chen family had already written my mother off. There was no fortune coming. But Marcus Chen, my uncle, had been investigating my mother's death on his own, operating outside the family's decision to abandon her. The morning I'd woken up reborn, I'd found the business card hidden in my mother's old music box. The one Helena hadn't found because it was buried in the garden under the rose bush my mother had planted. Chen the Collector, it read, with a phone number. In my previous life, I'd never found it. In this life, I'd known exactly where to look. But I hadn't called him right away. No, that would have been too simple, too easy. Instead, I'd started planning. I'd spent 3 months carefully documenting everything, recording conversations on a hidden phone I'd bought with money I stole from my father's wallet in small amounts, taking photos of Helena's poison collection disguised as research materials, gathering evidence of every crime they'd committed. Most importantly, I'd started playing into their plans while secretly sabotaging them. When Helena had started the poison regimen, I'd switched the bottles, ensuring I received harmless vitamins while Jessica unknowingly consumed small doses of a mild toxin that would cause embarrassing but non-fatal symptoms at crucial moments. When my father had tried to forge my signature on documents signing over my rights to my mother's estate, I'd let him, but not before ensuring copies went to 3 different lawyers with instructions to open them on specific dates. I'd also started leaving trails for Marcus to find. Anonymous tips about Helena's past victims, because my mother hadn't been the first. Financial records showing my father's debts to various unsavory individuals. Medical records proving the poison in my mother's system matched Helena's research. I'd made myself the breadcrumb trail that would lead him to the truth. And then, when my father's gambling debts had reached a critical mass and he'd started looking for a way out, I'd been the one to whisper Chen the Collector's name in the right ears, knowing it would get back to him. I'd played the broken daughter perfectly, letting him think I was so destroyed that I wouldn't even fight when he decided to sell me. The rope burns on my wrists were already healing as Marcus led me to his car, a black Mercedes that looked like it could survive a bomb blast. He hadn't said much since cutting me free, but I could see him studying me in the rearview mirror, noting the calculation in my eyes that didn't match the terrorized girl I was supposed to be. "You knew," he finally said, as we pulled through the gates of an estate that made my father's house look like a shack. "You knew who I was before you came to that warehouse." "Yes," I said simply. There was no point in lying to him. Marcus Chen hadn't survived this long in his world by being foolish. "How?" "Mother told me stories," I lied smoothly, "before she died. Stories about a brother who loved her enough to let her go but never stopped watching over her. She said, if I was ever in real trouble, if I ever had nowhere else to turn to find Chen the Collector." His hands tightened on the steering wheel. "She's been dead for 2 years." 2 years and 3 months, I corrected. "Murdered by the woman my father married. The same woman who's been slowly poisoning me for the last 6 months." The car came to an abrupt stop in the middle of this driveway. Marcus turned to look at me fully, and for the first time, I saw emotion crack through his controlled facade. "You have proof?" I pulled out the phone I'd hidden in my shoe, the one containing 3 months of recorded evidence. "Everything you need to destroy them. But I don't want them destroyed quickly. I want them to suffer first. I want them to lose everything, piece by piece, the way they took everything from me." A slow smile spread across his face, and in it I saw the family resemblance. Not to my gentle mother, but to the steel beneath her kindness. the core of strength that had let her walk away from everything she'd known for love. "You're definitely Anna's daughter," he said, "and a Chen, whether the family admits it or not." The estate was a fortress disguised as a mansion. Security cameras covered every angle, guards patrolled the grounds, and the technology inside would have made government agencies envious. Marcus led me to a suite that was larger than the entire first floor of my father's house, telling me to rest while he reviewed the evidence I'd provided. But I didn't rest. Instead, I used his computer. He'd given me the password, a test I'd passed by not using it immediately, to set the second phase of my plan in motion. Jessica was supposed to receive the Hartbridge Academic Excellence Award next week, a prestigious honor that came with a full scholarship to an Ivy League school. The essay she'd submitted had been mine, naturally. One I'd written about overcoming adversity that she'd stolen and submitted as her own. But I'd anticipated this. The original essay I'd written had been carefully crafted to include specific phrases and references that, when run through plagiarism software, would match a paper published in an obscure academic journal 3 years ago, a paper written by one M. Chen about teenage resilience in the face of family trauma. I sent an anonymous tip to the scholarship committee, along with the plagiarism report I generated. Then, I sent another tip to the local newspaper that had been planning to run a feature on Jessica's achievement. By morning, her bright future would be in ruins. Next, I turned my attention to Helena's professional life. Her research on synthetic compounds had earned her respect in the pharmaceutical community. But what they didn't know was that her data had been falsified. I'd found the real data during one of my late-night searches of her home office, experiments that had failed, results that didn't support her conclusions. She'd built her entire career on lies, and now those lies were about to be exposed. I uploaded the real data to several scientific watchdog sites, along with evidence of her human trials. Trials conducted on unwilling subjects, including my mother. The medical community took fraud seriously, but they took murder even more seriously. For my father, I had something special planned. His gambling debts weren't just to Chen. He owed money to several other creditors, all of whom had been patient only because they believed he had access to wealth through his wife and daughters. I'd been slowly feeding them information suggesting he'd been lying about his assets, that he was planning to flee the country with the money he'd gotten from selling me. By the time Marcus returned to check on me, I'd set dozens of small fires that would all ignite over the coming days, each one carefully timed to cause maximum damage. "You've been busy," he observed, looking at the browsing history I hadn't bothered to hide. "They took 3 years of my life," I said, not bothering to correct the mistake that revealed my impossible knowledge. "I'm just returning the favor." He sat down across from me, his expression thoughtful. "The evidence you provided, some of it includes information about Helena's previous victims. Information that wasn't public. Information that you couldn't have known unless I'd already lived through this once before," I finished for him. He didn't laugh or call me crazy. In his world, stranger things than rebirth were possible. Instead, he asked, "What happened the first time?" So I told him. I told him about dying alone and afraid, about the investigation that had come too late, about learning the truth only when it could no longer save me. I told him about waking up with a second chance and deciding that this time I wouldn't be a victim. "In my first life, you found out the truth after I died," I said. "You destroyed them then, but it was for revenge, not justice. This time, I wanted them to know exactly why they were being destroyed. I wanted them to see me standing strong while everything they'd built on my mother's grave crumbled around them." Marcus was quiet for a long moment. Then he stood and made a phone call in rapid Mandarin. I understood enough to know he was calling in favors, mobilizing resources, setting his own plans in motion. "Your father will try to run when he realizes what's happening," he said after hanging up. "He'll go to Helena first, then they'll try to liquidate their assets and disappear." "Let them try," I said. "I've already frozen the accounts they don't know I know about. The ones Helena used for her murder-for-hire business. The ones my father used to hide money from the IRS. They'll find themselves with nothing but the clothes on their backs and nowhere to run." The next morning, the news broke about Jessica's plagiarism. The scholarship committee had acted swiftly, not only revoking her award, but also notifying all the colleges she'd applied to. By noon, her acceptance letters were being revoked one by one, each school citing concerns about academic integrity. Jessica called me, sobbing and screaming, demanding to know how I'd done this to her. I listened to her rage for a full minute before speaking. "Did you really think you could steal my work forever?" I asked calmly. "Did you think there would never be consequences?" "It wasn't your work," she shrieked. "You're too stupid to write something like that. Mom said so. She said you were brain damaged, that you couldn't possibly—" "Your mother lied," I interrupted. "Just like she lied about being a respected researcher. Check the news, Jessica. Your mother's career is over." The pharmaceutical scandal had broken an hour earlier. Helena's research had been discredited. Her medical license was under review, and there were whispers of criminal charges related to the suspicious deaths of several trial participants over the years. Helena tried to call me next, but I didn't answer. I watched from Marcus's security monitors as she arrived home to find federal agents waiting with a warrant. They seized her computers, her files, everything that would prove what I already knew, that she was a killer for hire who'd used her medical knowledge to murder at least a dozen people over the past 15 years. My father was the last to realize what was happening. He'd gone to the bank to transfer the $50,000 to a secure account, only to find that all his accounts had been frozen. The IRS had received an anonymous tip about years of tax evasion, complete with documentation. His passport had been flagged, his credit cards had been canceled. He went home to find Helena being arrested and Jessica having a complete breakdown on the front lawn, screaming at reporters about how this was all a mistake, how she was the victim. The neighbors were watching from their windows, the same neighbors who'd whispered about what a difficult child I was, who'd believed every lie my family had told about me. That's when I arrived. Marcus had offered to send security with me, but I'd wanted to face them alone. I stepped out of the Mercedes wearing a simple black dress that had cost more than my father made in a month, my mother's pearl necklace around my neck. The one Helena thought she'd destroyed, but I'd actually hidden and replaced with a fake. "Hello, Father," I said, walking past the police tape like I had every right to be there. He stared at me in shock, taking in my appearance, the car, the confidence I'd never displayed before. How are you here? I sold you. You sold me to Marcus Chen," I said loudly enough for the reporters to hear. "My mother's brother, the one you didn't know existed because you never bothered to really learn about the woman you murdered." The reporters surged forward, shouting questions, but I only had eyes for my father. "Did you think about her at all when you hired Helena to kill her?" I asked. "Did you feel any remorse when you watched her getting sicker and sicker, knowing what was happening? Or were you too busy calculating how much her life insurance was worth?" "You can't prove anything," he stammered, but his face had gone pale. "I don't have to prove it," I said. "Helena already confessed. It's amazing what people will say when they're trying to make a deal with prosecutors. She's claiming you were the mastermind, that you forced her to do it. She has emails, texts, recordings of you planning everything." That was a lie. Helena hadn't confessed yet. But she would, once she realized the mountain of evidence against her, and understood that her only chance at avoiding the death penalty was to cooperate. My father didn't know that, though. He looked at Helena being put into the police car, saw her staring back at him with pure hatred, and believed. "I want to show you something," I said, pulling out my phone. I showed him a video, Marcus's security footage from the warehouse. "This is you selling your daughter to a loan shark for $50,000. The FBI is very interested in this, especially since you told them I ran away months ago. Filing a false missing person report is a crime, but human trafficking, that's federal prison." He lunged at me then, rage overcoming sense, but Marcus's men materialized from nowhere, restraining him before he could touch me. The reporters caught everything, the attempted attack, his incoherent screaming about how I'd ruined everything, how I was supposed to die like my mother. That's when Jessica broke completely. "It's not fair," she screamed, mascara running down her face in black rivers. "You were supposed to be nothing. Mom promised. She said you'd be gone soon and everything would be mine. The house, the money, everything. You're nobody. You're nothing. "I'm free," I said quietly, but my voice carried in the sudden silence. "I'm free, and you're about to learn what it feels like to be nothing. No college will accept you now. No employer will hire someone involved in this scandal. Every friend you had will abandon you rather than be associated with your family's crimes. You'll be exactly what you tried to make me, alone, helpless, and forgotten. The police took my father away in handcuffs. More agents arrived to search the house, and I knew they'd find everything I'd planted. More evidence of Helena's crimes, my father's financial fraud, even Jessica's academic dishonesty going back years. I'd been thorough. Marcus appeared beside me as the circus continued. "The family wants to meet you," he said quietly. "Your mother's parents, her siblings. They've been watching what you did here. They're impressed." "I don't want their approval," I said, still watching as my childhood home was torn apart by investigators. "I didn't do this for them." "No," he agreed. "You did it for Anna and for yourself. But they want to offer you something anyway, your birthright. Your place in the family if you want it." I thought about my mother, how she'd walked away from that world for love. But she'd walked away with choices, with freedom. That had been taken from her and from me. Maybe it was time to take it back. "I'll meet them," I said, "but on my terms." The news cycle exploded over the following weeks. Every day brought new revelations about the Marsh-Morrison family scandal. Helena's victim list grew as more families came forward. My father's financial crimes turned out to be even more extensive than I'd known. Jessica's entire academic career was revealed to be built on cheating and plagiarism. I testified at each trial, sitting calmly in the witness stand while they tried to tear me apart. Helena's lawyer tried to paint me as a vindictive daughter making up stories. My father's attorney suggested I was mentally unstable, traumatized by my mother's death. Jessica's representative claimed I'd framed her out of jealousy. But I had evidence for everything. Documents, recordings, videos, witnesses who'd finally found the courage to come forward. The jury saw through their lies just as clearly as I had. Helena got life without parole for multiple murders. My father got 25 years for human trafficking, tax evasion, and conspiracy to commit murder. Jessica, though she avoided jail time, was expelled from school, banned from every university in the state, and became a social pariah whose name was synonymous with academic fraud. The Chen family welcomed me with a mixture of respect and wariness. They'd never seen someone so young orchestrate such complete destruction of their enemies. My grandparents, who'd cut off my mother for choosing love, now saw in me the iron will they'd always wanted in an heir. But I didn't want to be their heir. I didn't want to rule their empire or continue their legacy of shadows and violence. What I wanted was simpler. I wanted to live the life my mother should have had, the life that had been stolen from both of us. I used my newfound resources to establish a foundation in her name, one that helped young women escape abusive families. I went to college, not the Ivy League school Jessica had dreamed of, but a small liberal arts college where I could study in peace. I learned to trust again, slowly, carefully, with people who knew my story and chose to stay anyway. Marcus remained my closest family, the uncle who'd been willing to destroy an empire to avenge his sister. He taught me about our mother's childhood, showed me photos Helena hadn't managed to destroy, told me stories that made her real in ways my memories couldn't. "She would be proud of you," he told me one evening as we stood in the garden of the estate, looking at roses that reminded us both of her. Not for the revenge, though she would have understood that, but for surviving, for refusing to let them win. I thought about my first life, how I died believing I was worthless, unloved, forgotten. I thought about waking up with a second chance and choosing to use it not just for vengeance, but for justice. I thought about my mother who'd chosen love and paid the ultimate price, and how I'd made sure that price hadn't been paid in vain. "They thought they could erase us," I said, touching the pearl necklace that had once been hers. "Both of us. Make us disappear like we never existed." "But you didn't disappear," Marcus said. "You became something they never expected. You became their reckoning." 6 months later, I stood in the prison visiting room, looking at my father through reinforced glass. He'd aged a decade in half a year, his hair gone gray, his face gaunt. He stared at me with a mixture of hatred and confusion, still not understanding how his perfect plan had gone so wrong. "Did you ever love her?" I asked, the question I'd carried through both lives. "Even for a moment, did you actually love my mother?" He was quiet for so long I thought he wouldn't answer. Then, in a voice rough from disuse, he said, "I loved what she represented. the escape from mediocrity, the chance to be more than a failed academic drowning in debt, but her? No, she was just a means to an end. And me? You were never supposed to exist, he said flatly. Helena was supposed to take care of that problem before you were even born. But Anna found out somehow, threatened to leave if anything happened to the pregnancy, so we had to wait, we had to pretend. The confirmation of what I'd always suspected should have hurt, but instead it freed something in me. All those years of trying to earn his love, of believing I was somehow deficient. None of it had been my fault. He'd been incapable of love from the beginning. I'm glad you told me, I said, standing to leave. Now I can forget you without guilt. Wait, he called as I walked away. The money, there has to be money, the Chen family fortune. You could get me out, make a deal, you could... I stopped at the door, looking back one last time. The only fortune I inherited from my mother was her strength, and that's something you can never take or buy or steal. The door closed on his shouting, and I never looked back. A year later, Helena died in prison. The official cause was a heart attack, but whispers suggested otherwise. The Chen family had a long reach, and while I hadn't ordered anything, I hadn't stopped it either. Some justice came from the courts. Some came from darker places. I'd learned to accept both. Jessica tried to rebuild her life under a new name in a different state, but the internet never forgets. Every job application, every new relationship, every attempt to start over was poisoned by the truth, following her like a shadow. The last I heard, she was working minimum wage at a gas station, living in a studio apartment, experiencing the poverty she'd always mocked me for fearing. I graduated summa cum laude with a degree in chemistry, a bitter irony considering Helena's profession. But I used my knowledge differently, developing antidotes for the kinds of poisons she'd specialized in, working with law enforcement to identify similar cases. 3 more of her victims were discovered because of my work, their families finally getting closure. The Chen family tried repeatedly to draw me deeper into their world, seeing in me the perfect heir, intelligent, ruthless when necessary, and bearing their blood. But I maintained my boundaries. I would be part of the family, but not part of the business. Marcus supported this decision, understanding that my mother had been right to seek a different path, even if she'd chosen the wrong partner to walk it with. On the 5th anniversary of my rebirth, I stood at my mother's grave with a bouquet of her favorite roses. The headstone had been replaced, the cheap marker my father had bought replaced with beautiful marble that bore her real name, not the false identity he'd tried to bury her under. I did it, Mom, I whispered to the stone. I made them pay for what they did to you, to us. And I survived. I more than survived. I thrived. I became everything they tried to prevent me from being. The wind rustled through the cemetery trees, and for a moment I could swear I smelled her perfume. The real one, not the fake Helena had replaced it with. It was probably just my imagination, a trick of memory and wishful thinking. But it felt like approval, like peace, like the closure my first life had never given me. Marcus found me there as the sun set, standing quietly beside me as we paid our respects to the woman who'd connected us across years of separation and pain. Any regrets? He asked. I thought about it carefully. Regret implied I would change something if I could, but every choice I'd made had led to this moment. Free, successful, surrounded by people who actually cared about me. No, I said finally. They made their choices, I made mine. And in the end, justice was served. We left together as darkness fell, driving back to the estate that had become my sanctuary. The guard at the gate nodded respectfully as we passed, and I realized how much had changed. I'd gone from being someone people pitied or ignored to someone they respected, even feared a little. But more importantly, I'd gone from being a victim to being a survivor. From being broken to being whole. From being forgotten to being unforgettable. That night, I dreamed not of the past but of the future. Of the girls my foundation would help escape their own nightmares. Of the scientific discoveries I might make. Of the love I might find with someone who saw me for who I really was, not what I could give them. I woke to sunlight streaming through windows that no one would ever lock me behind. I dressed in clothes no one would ever steal or destroy. I ate breakfast that no one had poisoned. Simple freedoms that most people took for granted, but that I'd earned through blood and sacrifice and a second chance I still didn't fully understand. My phone buzzed with a message from one of the girls staying at the Foundation's shelter. She'd escaped a situation eerily similar to mine: a stepmother who'd slowly been poisoning her, a father who'd turned a blind eye. She wanted to thank me for believing her when no one else would. I typed back a response. "You saved yourself, I just showed you it was possible." It was true. The Foundation provided resources, shelter, legal help, but the strength to use those tools came from within. Just like my strength had always been there, waiting for the chance to emerge. As I prepared for another day of classes, of work at the Foundation, of building the life my mother had dreamed of for me, I caught my reflection in the mirror. The girl staring back at me bore little resemblance to either version of my 18-year-old self. She stood taller, smiled easier, carried herself with the confidence that came from facing the worst and surviving. But the eyes were the same. My mother's green gold eyes. The Chen family eyes that had given me away to Marcus that day in the warehouse. Eyes that had seen too much but refused to look away. Eyes that had witnessed death and rebirth and chosen to make them both mean something. The news had mostly moved on from the Marsh Morrison scandal, but occasionally a reporter would reach out, wanting to know how I'd known, how I'd orchestrated such a complete downfall. I never gave interviews. Some stories were too strange for the public to believe. Some truths were better kept as secrets. But within the Chen family, my story had become legend. The girl who'd died and returned with vengeance. The heir who'd rejected power but claimed justice. The daughter who'd honored her mother by becoming everything her killers had feared. New initiates into the family were told my story as a warning and an inspiration. Marcus said I'd changed the way they operated, made them think about consequences differently. Where once they might have acted with impunity, now they remembered that sometimes the dead don't stay buried, that sometimes the victims become victors. I found it ironically appropriate. My father had sold me thinking I was worthless, but I'd become priceless. Helena had tried to erase me, but I'd become indelible. Jessica had tried to steal my life, but she'd ended up with nothing while I gained everything. 3 years after the trials ended, I received a letter from Jessica. She'd written it from a psychiatric facility where she'd been committed after a breakdown. The letter was rambling, incoherent in places, but the core message was clear. She wanted forgiveness. She wanted me to understand that she'd been manipulated by her mother, that she hadn't known how wrong it was, that she was sorry. I read the letter 3 times, then burned it. Forgiveness wasn't mine to give. She'd have to find that elsewhere if she could. My forgiveness was reserved for myself, for not being strong enough the first time, for taking so long to fight back, for all the small failures that had led to my first death. But mostly, I'd forgiven myself for surviving when my mother hadn't. That was the hardest forgiveness, the one that had taken years to achieve. The knowledge that I'd lived twice while she'd died once seemed cosmically unfair. But I'd learned to honor her memory by living well, by using my second chance to help others find their first. The Foundation grew beyond my wildest dreams. We opened shelters in 5 cities, helped hundreds of girls escape abuse, provided legal services that put dozens of predators behind bars. Every success story, every girl who went from victim to survivor, felt like a small redemption for my mother's death. Marcus helped with the Foundation, using his connections to ensure no one ever threatened our work. The Chen family's reputation for ruthlessness became our shield. Abusers learned quickly that targeting our girls meant facing consequences far beyond the legal system. We operated in the light, but we were protected by shadows. On what would have been my mother's 50th birthday, we held a gala to raise funds for the Foundation. The ballroom was filled with survivors, supporters, and skeptics who'd come to see the girl who'd brought down the Marsh Morrison empire. I wore my mother's wedding dress, the one Jessica had tried on while I was dying in my first life. I'd had it restored, altered to fit me, transformed from a symbol of deception into one of triumph. My speech that night was simple. My mother died believing in love that didn't exist. I died believing I was worthless. But death, I learned, isn't always the end. Sometimes it's a beginning. Sometimes it's a chance to rewrite the story. every person in this room has the power to rewrite someone's story. To be the voice that says, I believe you. To be the hand that pulls someone from darkness. To be the proof that survival is possible. The room erupted in applause, but I was looking at Marcus, who stood at the back with tears in his eyes. He'd lost his sister, but he'd gained a niece who'd exceeded every expectation. Later, he'd tell me that in that moment, he'd seen Anna in me. Not the gentle soul who'd left everything for love, but the steel core that had made that choice possible. The years passed. I earned my doctorate, specializing in forensic chemistry. I testified in dozens of cases where poisoning was suspected, my expertise helping to convict killers who thought they'd committed perfect crimes. Each conviction felt like a small victory against Helena's memory. I found love eventually, carefully, with someone who knew my entire story and wasn't frightened by it. David was a prosecutor who'd worked on my father's case, who'd seen me at my most vulnerable and most vicious and somehow found beauty in both. Our wedding was small, family only, which meant Marcus and a handful of Chen cousins who'd accepted me despite my refusal to join the family business. We had children, twins, a boy and a girl, who would never know the kind of childhood I'd endured. They grew up strong and loved, surrounded by security both physical and emotional. When they were old enough, I told them about their grandmother, the woman they'd never meet but whose strength ran through their veins. My father died in prison during my children's third birthday party. The news came as we were cutting cake, and I felt nothing. He'd been dead to me for years. The biological end of his life was just paperwork. I signed the forms to have him cremated, his ashes scattered in an unmarked location. He'd wanted to disappear me, and in the end, he was the one who vanished without a trace. Jessica was released from the psychiatric facility eventually, but she never tried to contact me again. The last update I received suggested she'd moved overseas, trying to find a place where her name meant nothing. I hoped she'd find peace, or at least the absence of the ambition that had destroyed her. 20 years after my rebirth, I stood in the same warehouse where my father had sold me. It was being demolished to make way for a new shelter, the largest one yet. Marcus stood beside me as the wrecking ball took its first swing. "Full circle," he said quietly. "No," I corrected. "Circles repeat. This is a spiral. We're in the same place but at a different level. Higher, better, free." The warehouse came down in a cloud of dust and memory. By the next year, it would be a place of hope instead of horror. Girls who'd been sold, abandoned, or thrown away would find safety where I'd found salvation in the form of an uncle who'd refused to forget his sister. My children grew up to be remarkable adults. My son became a doctor, dedicated to helping those who couldn't afford care. My daughter became a lawyer, specializing in family law, protecting children from the kinds of parents I'd had. They carried on the work in their own ways, the ripples of my second chance extending far beyond what I could have imagined. Marcus lived to see his great-nephew and great-niece graduate from university. He died peacefully in his sleep at 83, having spent his final years legitimate, using Chen resources to support the foundation and other charitable works. At his funeral, hundreds came to pay respects, not to Chen the collector, but to Marcus Chen, the man who'd saved his sister's daughter and changed an empire's destiny. He left me everything, despite my protests. The Chen family accepted it without argument. I'd proven myself not through violence or crime, but through justice and survival. I was the heir my mother should have been, the bridge between their dark world and the light. I used the inheritance to ensure the foundation would outlive me by centuries. Every year, hundreds of girls would find safety, support, and second chances. My mother's name would live not on a gravestone, but in the lives saved, the futures reclaimed, the stories rewritten. Standing at Marcus's grave, I made him the same promise I'd made my mother. I'll make it mean something, all of it. The pain, the death, the rebirth, I'll make it matter. The wind carried the scent of roses and I smiled. Somewhere, somehow, they were together, the siblings separated by choice and reunited by justice. Watching over me, over my children, over all the girls who would walk from darkness into light. I lived another 40 years after Marcus passed. I saw my grandchildren born, watched the foundation grow into an international organization, testified before Congress about domestic abuse and coercive control. I became the expert on family violence that Helena had pretended to be, the advocate my father had never been, the success story Jessica had tried to steal. When my time came, I faced it without fear. I died once in terror and confusion. This time, I died surrounded by love, by legacy, by the knowledge that I'd used my second chance to its fullest potential. My last thought was a question. If I woke up again, what would I change? The answer came immediately. Nothing. Every moment of pain had led to purpose. Every betrayal had built strength. Every loss had created space for something better to grow. I'd been reborn once to seek justice. If I was reborn again, it would be to something new, some challenge I couldn't imagine. But I would face it the way I'd learned to face everything, with the strength my mother had given me, the cunning the streets had taught me, and the knowledge that sometimes the best revenge isn't destruction. Sometimes it's living well, sometimes it's surviving. Sometimes it's taking the worst thing that ever happened to you and transforming it into the foundation of something beautiful. The girl who'd been sold for $50,000 had become priceless. The daughter who'd been poisoned had become the antidote. The victim had become the victor, and in the end, that was worth more than all the revenge in the world.